Almost everyone knows the name Thomas, even if they've never opened a Bible. He is history's ultimate skeptic, the one disciple who refused to take anyone's word for it. The traditional story goes that after the crucifixion, Thomas wouldn't believe Jesus had returned unless he could literally put his finger into the spear wound. He demanded to see raw, undeniable physical proof. For 2,000 years, that exact story has been used as a warning. It tells millions of believers that asking too many questions is a spiritual flaw, and that the highest virtue is believing without seeing. But archaeologists digging through the sands of Egypt in the late 19th and mid-20th centuries found a different narrative. They unearthed the lost Gospel of Thomas. In this text, Thomas isn't a skeptic. He is presented as the most advanced student in the group. Jesus even pulls him aside to give him secret, mystical teachings that the others simply aren't ready to hear. This raises a difficult question. How did a disciple celebrated in one text as a master student end up remembered in another as a faithless fool? The traditional Orthodox view frequently dismisses the Gospel of Thomas. Apologists typically label it a fake, a heretical forgery written late in the 2nd century, long after the original apostles were dead. But the physical artifacts tell a different story. Fragments of the Gospel of Thomas were discovered among the Oxyrhynchus Papyri in Egypt. Paleographers have dated these specific scraps to around 150 CE, making them just as old as the earliest known physical fragments of the New Testament. This text comparison illustrates a paleographic principle called Pagels rule. It states that when comparing two versions of an ancient passage, the more difficult, clunky reading is almost always the older one. Scribes copying manuscripts routinely smooth out the grammar and expand parables. When comparing Thomas to the exact same parables in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Thomas versions are consistently shorter, rougher, and lack the polished narrative framing. This combination of early physical manuscripts and primitive linguistics leads scholars to place the origin of Thomas's sayings in the first half of the 1st century, an early date that sets the text on a direct collision course with the Gospel of John. To understand this conflict, we have to look at the landscape of the early 1st century. Christianity wasn't a unified religion yet. Instead, it was a collection of isolated communities with sharply different ideas about who Jesus actually was. The community that revered the Gospel of Thomas viewed Jesus as a Jewish mystic. In their texts, Yeshua teaches that the divine, primordial light of God exists right now inside every single human being. Salvation comes from looking inward and recognizing that light. Meanwhile, over in places like Ephesus, the Johannine community was operating with a different objective. They were writing the Gospel of John, and they were trying to explain a Jewish rabbi to a sprawling, Gentile, Greco-Roman world. That Hellenistic audience already had plenty of stories about demigods coming down from the sky, performing miracles, and returning to the heavens. To make Jesus appeal to them, the authors of John framed him as the Logos, a divine, pre-existing deity who temporarily put on human flesh. The friction is immediate. If the Thomasine community is teaching that anyone can access God directly by looking inward, it conflicts with John's message that Jesus is the exclusive, singular gateway to the divine. This was a theological turf war. In the ancient Greek world, if you wanted to destroy a rival philosophical school, you didn't host a public debate, you wrote a polemic, a specific type of literature designed to attack an opposing ideology by weaving it into a narrative. The Gospel of John reads like a polemic against Thomas, starting from the very first chapter. Where Thomas says we all came from the light, John reframes it. He writes that the light of all people existed only in the person of Jesus. Then comes the characterization. In the other Gospels, Thomas is barely mentioned, but in John, he is suddenly a recurring character, and he is repeatedly depicted as a spiritual dunce. When Jesus talks about where he is going, Thomas is the one who interrupts to proclaim he has no idea what Jesus is talking about. John even attempts to remove his rival's authority in the early church. He goes out of his way to mention that Thomas was not present when Jesus first rose from the dead. Because witnessing the resurrection was a strict requirement for being considered an apostle, placing him outside the room effectively disqualifies him. All of this builds up to the climax of John's narrative, the doubting Thomas scene. Thomas refuses to believe the other disciples, demanding to physically touch the wounds, acting blind to the mystical realities his own namesake gospel preaches. And when Jesus finally appears, John forces the avatar of this rival mystical community to drop to his knees and declare, "My Lord and my God." John neutralized the competing theology by making its own founder submit to his. As a piece of ancient propaganda, John's narrative was effective. By the 4th century, the Thomasine community was marginalized and their texts were labeled as heretical. This visual shows the shift that followed. Christianity transitioned from an introspective practice focused on inner knowledge into a religion where salvation depends on believing specific claims about an external savior. The Gospel of Thomas survives as a rare view into a movement that predates these theological pressures. Reading it today allows us to step past 2,000 years of imperial councils and Roman polemics. It strips away the Greco-Roman mythology and gives us access to the paradoxical teachings of a 1st-century rabbi. The Gospel of Thomas removes the demand for blind belief. Instead, it invites seekers to view Yeshua as a master teacher, one who is pointing directly toward the divine light within themselves.